Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining today's webinar. We're coming to you live from Berlin. My name is Zach. I'm here with my colleagues Nicole, Surin, and Abdisamad, and we cordially welcome you to the webinar on the lessons learned from the sixth call. We have done some internal reflection for this webinar, and the objective today is to share some of this with you. Our goal here is to provide learnings with you and the wider climate finance community as the NAMA facility strives to be a learning hub. So let's begin today. First up here, we've got a slide of the webinar team. On the left, you'll find Nicole.
Hi.
In the middle, we've got Surin.
Hello.
And that is me on the right. In the background here, we have Abdisamad, and he's supporting us with technical backstopping and the chat function, FAQ function. And with that, I'll hand things over to Nicole to run you through the technical considerations.
All right. Hello, everybody. I will run through the function tab so that you know what to do during the webinar. So at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see this function tab. So on the left, we have the audio settings where you can change your microphone, your speaker, or your headphones. Here we have the chat and the raise hand functions. So due to the high number of participants, we won't be using either of these. And that's also why everybody else will be muted. Then we have the Q&A function, and you can leave the meeting at any point by clicking over here. Just know that if you do leave the meeting, you can always join once again, as long as the webinar is still taking place. So let's focus on the Q&A section. So if you press on this button, you will get this Q&A box or window. There you can input your question and hit send, and we will be able to read your question, and we'll try to answer it during our Q&A sessions. Please also, if you have any technical issues, let us know through the Q&A window. And if you face any technical issues like we did just now, just let us know through the Q&A, and we will try to provide immediate assistance. So now I will hand it over to Surin, who will give you some updates on the sixth call.
Thanks very much, Nicole, for that technical introduction. Hello also from my side. Before jumping into the actual agenda of today, I wanted to kick off with a brief update on both the sixth and the seventh call. Concerning the sixth call, first of all, our gratitude to all applicants who participated in that call. We have received 51 outlines this year round, and we appreciate the efforts undertaken by everybody to come up with outlines. We know that it is a lot of work, and we really appreciate it. Secondly, we would like to congratulate all those projects who made it to the DPP stage. And they're actually listed here on this slide. As you can see, there is 5 projects which have been selected and which will now enter into the DPP with 10 to 15 months of time up until they will provide the NSP proposal. So there is a livestock project from Honduras, and renewable energy project from Jordan, 2 energy efficiency projects from Mongolia and from Morocco, and notably, as it's the first time ever, we have that at the NAMA facility, a project from the forestry sector, which comes from Madagascar. So congratulations to all those projects who made it, and we are really looking forward to further pursuing the work with them. Secondly, on the seventh call, and we of course get a lot of questions on the next call each and every year. This year around, we can report that there will be at or around the COP conference in December an announcement by the NAMA facility on the seventh call, and it will be launched later. That means at the beginning of next year, with slightly different timeframes than in the previous years. We'll get back to some more details as we move along in this presentation. I would like to end this small update with a view to our current portfolio. You can see all our NSPs in here, and those projects who are in this color, so light blue, are those who are in DPP. And it's not only projects from the sixth call, but also those from the fifth call. So most notably, I think we can say for this year round, there's 2 new projects coming from Africa, notably the one in Morocco and on Madagascar. I'd like to close that description with a statement on distribution of NSPs per country. You might recall that we do have in our portfolio some countries, notably Thailand, Colombia, and Mexico, where we have several NSPs. The selection of projects in this year's call has not led to another country who would have a second or even a third or a fourth project. So we are basically entering with this 6th call selection into 5 new countries. Great, and with that, I would like to move on to a short overview as to the structure of our webinar. So I will pass on right now to Nicole for an introduction to the NAMA facility and an overview on some of the statistics of the 6th call. And thereafter, I will be sharing some of the analysis and lessons learned from the TSU as part of the 6th call. And then, following that second part, we will have a first interval of Q&As, and we would like to encourage you to simply present those questions you might be having, which will occur as part of this webinar. When they come up, they will be captured by us, and we try to respond to them in the 2 Q&A sessions we have. After this first Q&A session, we will move on with 2 parts presented by Zach, which will zoom into some technical observations related to the 6th call, and then also into a short project description to make you aware of the timelines we typically see in NSPs. And then last but not least, we will have that second Q&A session. Great. With that overview, I'd like to hand over to Nicole for the first part of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Søren. So I will, let's get started with a short introduction to the NAMA facility and some overview on the 6th call. So to begin with, what is the NAMA facility? We are a multi-donor fund established by Germany and the United Kingdom in 2013. Additional donors joined in 2015, Denmark and the European Commission. And as while the donors are the ones that are taking all of these strategic decisions, the NAMA facility is run on a day-to-day basis by the Technical Support Unit, the TSU, which is us here in Berlin. So let's take a look at this graph to explain a little bit about how the NAMA facility plays a role in here. So through NSP's NAMA support projects, the NAMA facility supports developing countries and emerging economies in implementing ambitious NAMAs, or nationally appropriate mitigation actions. These NAMAs are important building blocks in implementing the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which fall under the Paris Agreement. It is also important for us to mention that the NAMA facility does not have the capabilities to support a full implementation of NAMAs as such. And therefore, we require the leverage of other sources of financing, which can be in the form of partner governments, national or international banks, and private sources. So as you probably already know, the TSU runs the annual competitive bidding rounds that we call the calls for NAMA support projects. And in the previous 5 calls, we have selected 26 NSPs for support. And as Søren previously mentioned, this year on the 6th call, we have selected further 5 new projects for a total of 31 NSPs for our portfolio, which accounts for 420 million euros of funding. It is also important for us to point out that the NAMA facility does not have any regional or sectoral focus. And with that in mind, we go ahead and we look at some of the statistics of the 6th call in comparison to those from our previous call, from the 5th call. Here you can see that we have received this year a total of 51 outlines, which is quite a fewer than the previous call, and we will dive into the details of that later on during this webinar. Out of those 51 outlines, 16 were resubmissions, same as the call before. It is also important to point out that this was the first year in which all of the submissions were considered eligible, and therefore they were all initially assessed. We have received 16 different outlines from 12 different least developed countries, or LDCs. We also received 5 outlines from 4 small island development states, or SIDS, for a total requested funding of 800 million euros, which makes for an average of 15.7 million euros, which is a little bit higher than the average we had on the year before. So here we have an overview of all of the outlines that we have received. This is classified by region and by call. So here you can see the darkest columns are those from our first call, and then our blues get a little bit lighter until they come to the 6th call. I hope you can clearly differentiate them. And so in this 6th call, we have received a big amount of outlines from Asia. We can see here we have 18, followed by Africa with 16 outlines. Next, we have outlines from the Americas. We received 15 this year. And from Europe and Oceania, we received 1 from each. So let's go on to see the overview of the outlines received by sector. Once again, the same colors. So for the 6th call, as it has been in previous years as well, the biggest amount of outlines comes from energy sector. So we have 13 from energy efficiency and 13 outlines from renewable energy. They were followed by agriculture outlines that we received 9 this year. Then we received 7 outlines from forestry and land use, 6 outlines from the transport sector, and 3 outlines from the waste and wastewater treatment sector. In this, here you can see we have this other category. So those are those projects that do not fall into any of these categories. For example, NSPs that are trying to set up climate funds to help other NSPs, and also those who focus on more than one of this main sector. So those have been deemed as other category, and this year we didn't receive any of those. So we here dive into a bit more into our actual portfolio of the NSPs that we have selected. Here you can see that the NSPs that we got from calls 1 to 5 are in darker blue, and the lighter blue refers to the 5 NSPs that we have selected for the 6th call. And as you can see, we still haven't gotten any from Europe or Oceania that have been selected. And we have gotten 2 new projects from Africa, as Søren mentioned earlier. And this is actually noteworthy since it's slowly equalizing the regional distribution of our NSPs. Then we go into the funding volume by sector of our NSPs. So again, we've received 2, we can see that there's a focus on the energy efficiency sector. We've received the 2 new NSPs on that, and 1 on the renewable energy sector. We have not chosen any NSPs in the transport sector this year. We have 1 in the agricultural sector, and again, just to emphasize, it's the first time that we've received and we have selected a project in the forestry sector. And last but not least, this is a graph that shows us the leverage funds for the 5 NSPs that we have selected from the 6th call. We can see here that the NAMA facility has provided more than 10% of the funds for these NSPs. Then the funding is followed by the public funding that is a little bit more than 20%. Then we have received, they have received around 24% of funding from other donors, and then the highest share of funding comes from private funding, which amounts to almost 50% of all of the funds. So that was our short introduction and overview on the 6th call results. Now I will go on to give Søren the floor. He will go into the first part of the core of this webinar, that is the 6 call analysis and lessons learned.
Great, thanks very much again, Nicole, for handing over to me. I wanted to lead you basically through 4 slides and some messages, only to not have this part too long, as we want to have as much time as possible for questions, of course. So remember to present those questions to us as we talk. Some of the interesting features we have noted when we were engaged in the assessment of the 6 call outlines are summarized on this chart. And actually, we could have, of course, noted much more here. A lot of the things we see actually reoccur over the years. And they would also be featuring in material we've made available previously. But just to mention these 3 aspects listed here, we have seen as an interesting feature, and that pertains not only but mainly to one project we have selected, and that is notably Mongolia. An aspect that there is very strong buy-in and ownership by city level government in that particular NSP. We've seen it in other outlines as well, and it is typically the larger cities, if not the capitals of those countries, who are right from the start quite instrumental in strategizing around the outline, showing ownership and endorsement, and really supporting the outline right from the start. And we believe that is a very, very good sign for any project, as it shows that it's well embedded and has the chances to quickly gain momentum. Secondly, and that is something which is really quite particular, I believe, to the 6 call, we have seen outlines. Just to mention 2, one is proposing intervention in the hydrogen sector and the other one on tidal energy. So we have seen a number of outlines which propose to intervene in technologies which are proven, but which haven't yet been kind of pushed to a level of commercial viability. And we've had a discussion with the board who reconfirmed its position on such projects, which we call demonstration projects. So as long as the technology suggested is proven, and that is something which would be in general be eligible for support from the NAMA facility, if it then targets a larger rollout to prove and enhance the commercial viability of such technologies. So although we haven't selected outlines from this particular segment this year round, we would really like to encourage applicants to continue to consider those and the outlines to be resubmitted, actually, which we have seen this year round. And then thirdly, there is the aspect of behavioral change. It's something which is definitely not new to the NAMA facility. We see it in a lot of outlines, but from the basis of our theory of change, in the NAMA facility, we really believe that at the core of any NSP, there is the request to mobilize funding to achieve mitigation. And that holds true, we believe, for actually all projects. But there are certain sectors where the point of departure should normally be behavioral change. And we noted an example here from the agriculture, and that actually pertains to Honduras, where there is also a financial component included in that NSP, but the main driver to achieve the mitigation is really the advice, in this case, to smallholder farmers. So behavioral change is really at the heart of this NSP, and we believe that this is a very good example which should actually be replicated in a lot of other project outlines to really properly engage typically with end clients or small and medium enterprises to ensure that they change their behavioral patterns. Great. With that, I would like to move on with some of the general things we have seen this year around and liked. Unfortunately, these remarks don't apply to all the outlines, but notably we have seen a number of outlines who really presented us with ambitious yet realistic approaches and targets, both to mitigation as well as leverage. You know that we really expect the NSPs to have a substantial degree of ambition in their targets, but of course they need to remain realistic at the same time. We know that it is a different gap to be bridged, but projects who are overly ambitious are typically excluded if we get the impression that it's not realistic, and if they are simply not ambitious enough and too close to a business as usual scenario, they would probably also not make it to any next stage. Secondly, when it comes to assumptions and mitigation potential assessment of projects, particularly in the forestry sector, we know that there is a lot of uncertainty as to its quantification. And we have seen, not only in the Madagascar outline, but also in other cases, applicants quite frankly actually outlining that they have doubts as to how they can best quantify mitigation. And we think this is a very good and sound approach to also admit in areas where you are uncertain about what suitable assumptions would be, to simply make that explicit. And as you can see from the case of Madagascar, in that particular outline, we nonetheless selected it to go to DPP. However, and that's the third bullet here, in cases where the calculation of the mitigation potential is pretty much straightforward exercise, we do expect that applicants do their homework. So yeah, when it comes to projects from energy efficiency or even more so from renewable energy, we believe that underlying assumptions are pretty straightforward, and then we would also expect all applicants already at outline stage to do the required homework and come up with sound information. The fourth point here refers to an aspect which is not really new, but we see more and more outlines who actually manage to come up with a mitigation calculation based on the fact that activities start at a certain moment in time, but that of course actual mitigation only kicks in later. I think that distinction between start of the NSP and actual achievement in terms of mitigation is quite important, and we see it luckily in more and more outlines. We would hope that next year around actually each and every outline would consider that quite crucial point, because otherwise if you assume mitigation kicking in from day one, quite often that would lead to quite unrealistic and actually over ambitious targets with regards to mitigation. And then last but not least, a point on phase-out concepts, something which is also explicitly required at outline stage already. And we simply wanted to reconfirm that we really at this stage do need at least an indication of what general concepts and ideas are available, how the phase-out of the NSP could occur, and how additional funding which might be required thereafter could be mobilized. Great, and with that, I would move on to financial mechanisms. That people who have been following us for a long time, that is one of the classics really of what we preach and live. We believe that the financial mechanisms are typically extremely important for any NSP to achieve upscaling of activities and achievement of mitigation in broader terms. Those are bullet points here which I believe should be surprising for anybody. If you don't have a proper barrier analysis at the beginning, when you put together your outline, you will probably also struggle to come up with a proper design of individual and suitable financial mechanisms. And then there is some follow-on consequences to that, which we've also mentioned here. A proper barrier analysis would, in nature, also lead you directly to a proper understanding of end users' needs. So that is something which basically goes hand in hand. And if you haven't done that exercise of a proper barrier analysis, what typically happens then, and we've seen that in a lot of outlines, then you also are typically not able to properly fine-tune and tailor-made the financial mechanisms you need, and that might lead to random choices and resulting low scores in that area. And that's the last bullet here. Typically then also outlines who haven't done this proper analysis in the first place, they would try to do all sorts of things at the same time, which also simply would not appear credible to us. There's a lot of information on all these aspects available. Please follow this link, which we have here on this slide, to our publications. We have a separate webinar on the financial mechanisms. There's presentations. We've touched on it in previous webinars on lessons learned from previous calls. So try to use that information to refine outlines for subsequent calls. Almost half an hour gone. This is my last slide for this section. Just to summarize the feedback we have been receiving from applicants. As in previous years, everybody who has received that feedback was quite appreciative of the fact that that was possible. By now, I believe half of applicants who haven't been selected for the DPP have received such feedback, and it's really a useful exercise, not only for applicants, but also for ourselves to properly understand where bottlenecks are in terms of project development in the first place, and to offer some guidance for possible resubmissions, of course. Applicants do appreciate webinars like we're holding today and the application materials, so everybody seems to be happy with that. Then on the backside of that, most applicants actually said they would like to have more time for questions, and they are also looking for longer application time frames. And we believe that next year around, the timeline for the 7th call will look differently from that of the previous year. I personally believe that one of the reasons that we have received less outlines this year around than in the previous 2 years might be connected to the fact that application timelines were shorter last year around. We will rectify that in the next year. So you can expect that there will probably something like a month more time, and possibly also more leeway time to be made aware that the 7th call will actually be coming. So we hope that we can accommodate your needs better with regard to timelines. What will not change, and that is the 4th bullet here on this slide, the 2 annexures which have been voluntary contribution to outlines up until the 5th call, and which were made obligatory with the 6th call, and that is annexures 6 and 7, which pertain to mitigation potential and business models. They will remain mandatory, as they are really crucial for us to properly assess the outlines. We hope that you understand it. Great. That resumes the second part of the webinar. I would now like to hand over to Nicole and Zach to lead us through the first Q&As.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, we have collected some of your questions that we've received, and we wanted to take a couple minutes to answer a few of those. Maybe we'd start with this one.
So Sandra Lopez is asking, for the unselected outlines, will it be informed formally?
Yeah, so I think as Søren kind of went through, we do definitely inform all applicants whether that they're moving to the next phase or not, of course. And we also offer each one the opportunity for a feedback call. I think that's really a unique feature of the NAMA facility. We provide in-depth guidance on how they can improve the project potentially for the next stages.
Okay. The next question says, regarding the leveraging of other sources of funding for the NSPs, how was this assessed in the selection process? In other words, what is the importance placed on this aspect of NSP outlines? If NAMA facility funding will leverage financing in subsequent stages following those supported directly by the NAMA facility, is that accepted?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, the barrier analysis for NAMA support projects, those really identify the things that inhibit private capital working already in this area. And basically, the financial mechanism should work to remove those barriers and leverage as much private capital as possible. So, of course, the more the better. The kind of ideal standard that we look at is a 1-to-7 ratio, and that should be demonstrated within the scope of the NSP lifetime. The more that can be described happening outside of that scope is great, but how we assess the projects, the first and foremost point is what happens within the NSP lifetime.
Okay. The next question is, if the city is the primary applicant, what kind of involvement would the national government have?
Okay, so that's a great question, because it is sort of a new or unusual feature to have a city leading the way in an NSP. But they are not, the NAMAs are nationally appropriate mitigation actions. So of course they need to somehow be embedded or anchored in a national context. So at the very least, we do still need to have endorsement letters from the relevant line ministry and the ministry involved in UNFCCC negotiations if they're not the same. So at the very least, we need that sort of level of national endorsement. And then, of course, the more endorsement at the city level, the better. So looking at the time here, we might need to move on. Don't worry, we will answer your questions via email afterwards if we don't get to them today. And just to let you know, the presentation will definitely be put on our website next week. Great.
Excellent, great. Thanks very much for this first Q&A session. I think we will have some more questions then towards the end at the second session, of course. I'd now like to hand over to Zach again for the third part of the webinar on sectoral observations related to the sixth scope. Zach, please.
Great, thanks for that, Søren. So let's start with the transport sector. As you've probably already also seen, electric mobility programs are rapidly gaining ground across the world, and that includes our portfolio. So when looking at different modes or technologies, it's important to ensure that a specific one is chosen for the intervention and to clearly describe the justification for it. Too many approaches can dampen the project's feasibility. And the private sector can also play an important role to support infrastructure projects. It's important not to forget that aspect. Due to the long-lasting nature of transport projects and what is often considerable lead time needed to fully develop, the bulk of the mitigation potential will often lie beyond the NSP implementation phase. But it is important to highlight what the mitigation potential is within the NSP lifetime, and not only the technology. And transport initiatives can be long-term investment projects with long gestation times, so plan realistically for these preparation timelines. And there's also typically a complex web of stakeholders, so be sure to plan accordingly and ensure that there is an adequate level of stakeholder buy-in. And of course, don't forget about displacement and the informal economy, which can definitely be tricky issues with transport projects. Moving on here to energy efficiency, let's start with energy efficiency in appliances and hardware specifically. Energy efficiency projects should not forget about transformational change. Simple replacement schemes are insufficient. They do need to develop an appropriate financial mechanism, leverage private investment, and engage in other areas as necessary to effect a sector transformation. Often applicants would just suggest one-time replacement programs, for example, looking at fridges or air conditioners. And this would result in a one-time intervention with no sustainable effect. And on top, it might create technological lock-in effects. Such simple support to new appliances is not seen as ambitious. The NAMA facility would look for an NSP embedded in a sector strategy that would aim at a continuous increase in efficiency. So for example, by implementing top runner principles or regular updates of MEPS and labels. Don't forget about rebound effects. Scrappage schemes must remove old devices from the market to actually lock in the mitigation effects. And the scrappage schemes must also be described in detail, not just mentioned without substantiation. So it should take in the country context and therefore the country capacities into account, and potentially find a way to see how the NSP could work to improve these capacities. And it's also important to pay attention to potential market distortions, such as bulk procurement schemes or grant support that would only benefit one or two suppliers and actually exclude others. So moving on then to the next part of energy efficiency, let's take a look at buildings. A holistic whole building approach to buildings should be used instead of simply targeting low-hanging fruit. For example, only replacing lighting or air conditioners, boilers, just simple replacement scenarios like business as usual have a low transformational effect typically. The quality, the safety, the performance of equipment should also be considered and described. For example, it's important to consider flammability if you're looking at housing insulation, building resilience in earthquake-prone areas, etc. And for energy efficiency and new housing, should consider lessons learned, for example, from the Mexico Housing NAMA Support Project. And it's important to ensure that new housing developments integrate issues of urban planning. That is, they should require a concept for social infrastructure and public transport. And it's important to ensure that, for example, new housing developments won't induce rebound effects, such as the construction of more large road systems and the addition of more vehicles to the area. And let's take a look at the waste sector now. When discussing the approach of circular economy, be sure that the concept is thoroughly researched and its tenets are included in the project design so that it's not merely a buzzword without substantiation. Some NSP outlines did not address waste prevention, or they didn't engage in waste segregation. The waste hierarchy is the guiding principle that requires details on the NSP's approach to waste prevention. So it's important to pursue a circular economy approach, but not just label your NSP as circular economy without justification. It's also important to identify, comprehend, and articulate responses to fundamental financial barriers, particularly around market barriers to private sector participation. So sustainability of financing model to ensure that cost coverage is met is really important. Additionally, it's important to address regulatory issues that would prevent successful implementation. And it's also key to identify barriers and measures to address required behavioral change, as Soren mentioned already. And selected technologies do need to be adapted to conditions and need to be sufficiently detailed or justified. And here as well, social aspects of workers and the inclusion of informal waste pickers should definitely be considered. Moving on then to renewable energy. Regarding mitigation potential, it is clear that mini grid projects do tend to have rather low mitigation. And as a climate mitigation facility, this is obviously important for us at the NAMA facility. As with all projects, the transformational effect does need to be clearly demonstrated. That is how the NAMA support project triggers a sectoral change instead of simply financing a few projects. And the effect of fossil fuel subsidies, if applicable in specific case, on the NAMA support project must be analyzed or leveraged even in some cases, and other relevant regulations like national energy tariffs need to be considered. When designing renewable energy projects, be sure to ensure that the focus is more on renewable energy development and not just simple electricity access. And taking a look at the last sectors here, we've got agriculture and forestry. So It's important to note labeling and certification, and there need to provide rationale. If aspects of these are included in the design, you should carefully consider the time needed to develop and execute, and ensure that this is based on realistic assumptions. The environmental issues and biodiversity also warrant specific consideration, as do rebound effects, which need to be included in the greenhouse gas mitigation calculations. Upscaling can prove difficult, and farmers live in different regions or different climate zones. In that case, it can be important to leverage groups, farmers groups, cooperatives, in order to increase information sharing and cooperation. Regarding forestry, it's important to address leakages in any forestry project or component, and the REDD+ mechanism could be used if the NSP design is in line with the national or regional REDD+ strategy. And lastly here, an important question to consider is how does the NSP engage relevant stakeholders, such as in local communities, and how are polluters like wood or agri-industry engaged? So that is what we have for sectoral observations. Now what we'd like to do is, in our last piece, kind of zoom in on one of our NAMA support projects, and that is the Mexico SME Energy Efficiency Project. Since 2012, Mexico has actually established a comprehensive climate change policy framework. But despite many efforts, energy intensity has remained stable and emissions steadily increased. But in November 2015, Mexico established ambitious nationally determined contributions, committing to reduce its greenhouse gases. As part of this background, we now have 3 NAMA support projects at the NAMA facility level that are in implementation. And this is one of them. The partner ministries involved are the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry for Environment and Natural Resources, and the NAMA support organization is GIZ. This one is actually from the 4th call, and it entered implementation in February of this year. So just kind of a quick overview of what this project does. As SMEs account for 75% of employment and 50% of GDP, in the country, investment in energy efficiency measures by businesses is often overlooked as a viable business case. But this NSP seeks to affect a shift in perception and educate stakeholders of energy efficiency investment's value as a smart business decision. And as part of this project, 9,000 energy efficiency projects are to be developed over the NSP lifetime, and they will target subsectors that do have the most greenhouse gas emissions. In order to facilitate this, the financial mechanism is to set up a guarantee fund that will offer attractive lending environment to commercial banks. So we also wanted to take this NAMA support project and kind of run it through our process timeline so that you can get a better overview of how long this can actually take and what is involved in some of the steps. So we'll start here where the funding decision was unveiled for the call, the 4th call. This is month 4/July 2016. The call was then open for a few months, until month 4. The outlines were assessed in month 4 by the TSU through month 7. The board then made a decision month 8 regarding which NSPs entered the DPP. And then that process lasted from February 2017 through July 2018. So that's month 8 through 25. At the end of that, then, the proposal was produced, submitted for evaluation by the TSU, by the NAMA facility, and that process took about 4 months. The board then made a decision in February 2019, and that looks like it took a little bit of time, but in the meantime there, the board made a clarification request to the project because due to the change in government, they had to update their endorsement letters from the national government. That was then finally obtained in February 2019, and at that point, the project entered implementation. So while it might look like a long period of time from July 2016 through February 2019, But if you'll note, a big bulk of that time was spent month 8 through 25 in the DPP. During this time, the NAMA facility provides our projects with financial and technical support to further elaborate the project concept so that the level of readiness is high enough to enter implementation and to successfully deliver the project objectives. So now we'd like to start off the Q&A, and I think to get us started here, we have Søren and Nicole, and they have collected some of your questions.
Yeah, okay. So one of the questions is, you mentioned equalizing the regional distribution of projects. I am curious to know if you intend to also equalize the sectoral distribution of projects.
Okay, the guidance from our board is that there is no real quotas, neither for regions nor for sectors. So if we mentioned earlier on that with the selection of the sixth call, we have more projects in Africa and kind of more equal distribution of projects around the world, that is more by coincidence than by anything else. And I believe the same does apply for the selection of projects according to sectors. So the board does not have a specific preference for any sector, and it is not foreseeable that they would select a project just because it comes from a certain sector, and definitely not to have a more equal distribution in the portfolio. If you have a look at the selection which was now happening for the sixth call, there were two projects, one from the transport sector and one from the waste sector, which were also among those visited for on-site assessment and quite close actually to being selected for DPP. But then other projects were simply stronger. I believe the selection criteria from the board will remain stable over the next years. So it is really a mix of ambition and feasibility of projects, and that is really irrespective of the sectors. At the same time, donors look at projects in their country-specific context, so they would probably look into projects from SIDS or LDCs more favorably than to those of mid-income countries if they would offer the same level of ambition and feasibility. So I think that is all we can say at this stage. No, there will be no equaling out with regard to sectors. Hasn't happened in the past, won't happen in the future.
All right. The next question says, any webinars planned on the new required annexes, such as Annex 7 business model and financial model, or other additional guidance for this annex?
Yeah, that's an easy one. We have run through those annexures and will probably do so again when we have a new webinar where we'll be briefing on the application documents for the 7th call. So we've done that for both the 5th and the 6th call. If you would browse into those webinars, which are available on our website, you would find sections with slides where there is descriptions with some remarks, and of course in the videos there's some explanation given as to what exactly we require from these annexures. And I think it's also worth mentioning that if you have a look at the current GID, the General Information Document, which is kind of the Bible of the NAMA facility, where the rules of the game are described, that has been and that will remain more or less stable. So we have only seen minor changes from the 4th to the 5th and from the 5th to the 6th call, and I expect the same situation when we move on to the 7th call. So if you have a look at current documents, so the GID for the 6th call and the webinar which was held to introduce the 6th call, there will be some sections zooming into that information.
Okay, and the next question asks, is it possible to finance NSPs in the same productive sector it is contained in the same? For example, Mexico and Colombia.
Okay, I'm not quite sure if I understand this question correctly, but what I believe the underlying aspect is if you can hand in an outline which covers 2 countries. And we have seen that actually in previous cases. And that is kind of a difficult situation because the NAMAs are, of course, they are, of course, based on national priorities and national policies. So to combine 2 together is something which, frankly speaking, hasn't been selected by the board so far. We have seen applications which intended to intervene in regions, so in neighboring countries. That is something which the GID says explicitly is eligible for support, but to allow for regional projects, you would need to underline what additional benefits you create by covering several countries. So I think in general it's fair to say that NAMAs per se are complicated enough to be implemented in one country. So our recommendation would be, as a point of departure at least, to rather focus on one than on several countries.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more question.
Sure.
Okay, so our next question is...
We've actually been asked by participants which organizations are behind the 6 Call NAMA support projects.
Okay, you want to respond to that, Zach?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our project in Honduras, that was submitted also with Katia. In Jordan, it was the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Madagascar was the World Bank. Mongolia was GGGI and ICLE. And Morocco was a joint submission by AFD, the French Development Agency, and GIZ.
All right, thanks for that. Okay, I'm looking around. We got the impression that we are well covered. No additional questions we would like to address here. There are a couple of more questions which we received, but to which I think we would respond individually because they cover specific interests, and I think they are better catered for individually. Super. So I'd like to thank Zach and Nicole for running this webinar together with me. Thanks to all participants of this webinar. Look out for the presentation and the video, which will become available on our website by the latest next week. And then last but not least, would like to encourage you to follow us on our website. Stay tuned to be aware when the 7th call will be announced. And we are already now looking forward to submissions for that 7th call. Thanks very much and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.